The year 1883 burned the hope out of Bitterroot Flats. The sun was no longer a friend, but a warden, hanging in a sky gone milky with dust, pulling the last of the moisture from the earth until it cracked into a web of fissures like old scars. The wind brought no relief. It only moved the heat around, whispering through brittle sagebrush and carrying away the quiet prayers of men and women whose eyes were hollowed out by exhaustion and worry. The drought hadn't just withered the land. It had parched the human spirit, leaving a brittle silence where even the cry of a hawk felt like an intrusion into this quiet kiln of a valley. The stagecoach from the east arrived, groaning under its own weight and the world's weariness. It pulled to a stop before the collection of raw timber buildings that passed for the center of Red Mesa Crossing. They looked as if they had been put up in a hurry and might be taken down by the next strong gust of wind. When the door swung open, a cloud of fine dust rolled in, and out stepped Eliza Marlowe. She was not the kind of woman the valley was used to. The town knew women of leathery skin and calloused hands, women whose forms were shaped by labor. Eliza was different, though her traveling dress was grimed with the journey and faded by the sun. There was a fineness to her carriage, a straightness in her shoulders that seemed to defy the oppressive heat. She clutched a scuffed leather suitcase, its corners worn through and one of its straps replaced with a length of twine. That suitcase, like her eyes, seemed to hold more miles than one could see. Her eyes were the color of sage after a rare rain, but they were guarded, holding a secret so well kept that no one felt bold enough to ask its name. She was the new schoolteacher, come to bring letters and numbers to children whose futures looked as barren as their parents' fields. As she stood, letting her vision adjust to the glare, she felt the eyes on her. They came from the men slouching on the porch of the general store, from the women who hurried past with empty buckets, from the children who stared from dusty alleyways. In Red Mesa Crossing, a stranger was as rare an event as a rain cloud, and subject to just as much scrutiny. And then she saw him. He wasn't part of the crowd, but stood apart from it, leaning against a support post of the livery stable. He wasn't staring, not in the way the others were. His gaze was calmer, more encompassing, as if he were measuring her against the landscape itself. This was Jonah Creed, master of the Cedar Hollow Ranch. Though she did not know his name yet, he was a man made of the land itself, lean and weathered, with a stillness about him that could make other men uneasy. He wasted no movement, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a stained hat, or the gray of the sky just before a red dust storm, holding a quiet intensity that made you want to look away. He watched her for a long moment, not with judgment, but with a deep, assessing observation. Then turned his head, his gaze drifting toward the distant, heat-shimmered hills as if she were merely a passing detail in a long day. The air was thick with more than just dust. In the Coyote Lantern Saloon, the one establishment that seemed to thrive in the dry spell, the talk was not of weather. It was of whispers, traded over glasses of warm whiskey, about shadows that moved in the night, the Painted Knives Gang. No one knew where they came from, but their sign was unmistakable, a knife with a hilt painted blood red, left where they had been. They didn't hit banks or stagecoaches. They went after things far more precious. They raided homesteads for water, stole cattle for food, and spread fear like a contagion. The saloon whispers drifted out like stale smoke, seeping into every home and making the nights feel a little more dangerous. The town's desperation came to a head that week at the water auction. This was no social gathering. It was a battle for survival. People from all over the valley gathered in a cleared patch of ground at the edge of town. A few barrels of water, hauled from the last trickling creek in the county, sat on a makeshift platform. The auctioneer, a man with a sun-scalded face and a voice cracked with dust, didn't need a fancy sales pitch. Everyone knew the value of what he was selling. 50 cents a barrel, who'll give me 50 cents, he rasped, and a reluctant hand went up. The price climbed quickly. Men bid with coins they had set aside for seed or wire, their face taut with calculation. Every barrel sold was a sentence passed on the one who couldn't afford it. Eliza stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands clenched around her small reticule. The schoolhouse had no well, and the children came to their lessons with cracked lips and listless eyes. She could not teach them sums when they could barely swallow. Finally, the last barrel was rolled forward. It was smaller than the rest, but the water inside was clear. "Last one for the day, folks," the auctioneer called. "We'll start the bidding at 40 cents. Eliza took a sharp breath. 40 cents, she called out, her voice clear and precise in the thick air. Heads turned. A hush fell over the assembly. The city school teacher was bidding for water. The auctioneer paused for a beat, then nodded. The teacher bids 40. Do I hear 45? A nearby rancher, his face a roadmap of worry, lifted a single finger. 45. 50, Eliza said immediately, her voice steady. It was nearly all the money she had to her name. The rancher shook his head and stepped back. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. 50 cents. Will anyone go higher going once, going twice? Just as his mallet was about to fall, a hand rose from the back of the crowd. It was a calm, unhurried gesture, but it stopped everything. It was Jonah Creed. He said nothing. He simply raised his hand. The auctioneer squinted. "Mr. Creed, what's your bid?" Jonah lowered his hand and spoke a single word, his voice a low rumble, as if it hadn't been used in some time. $1. A murmur went through the crowd. $1. Double the going price. It wasn't a bid. It was a final statement. No one would counter it. "Sold to Jonah Creed for $1, the auctioneer shouted, bringing his mallet down with a sharp crack. Jonah moved forward, his stride deliberate. He placed a silver dollar in the auctioneer's palm without a glance at the barrel. Then he turned, and for the first time, his storm-gray eyes met Eliza's directly. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod toward the barrel. "It's yours, ma'am," he said, and started to walk away. Eliza stood frozen for a moment. The crowd began to disperse, but their whispers remained, hanging in the air. The lonely rancher spoke to the city school teacher. Why would he do a thing like that? He never speaks to anyone. She hurried after him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sir, please wait." Jonah stopped, but did not immediately turn. He stood with his back to her, his shadow stretching long in the fading afternoon light. When he finally faced her, his expression was unreadable. I can't accept this," Eliza managed, her breath coming in short bursts. "I have the money. I can pay you back." "You bid what you had," he stated, his voice flat. It wasn't enough. "But why?" she asked, her confusion overriding her pride. He looked at her then, a look so direct it felt as if he could see every dusty road she'd traveled, every frayed edge of the life packed into her worn suitcase. "The children need water," he said simply, as if it were the only explanation required in the entire world. They stood in silence, the air between them seeming to hum with unspoken things. The heat of the day was finally beginning to break, and a slight breeze stirred, carrying the scent of dust and dry sage. Eliza felt a strange sensation, a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. It was a long-forgotten feeling. She looked down at her own hands, then back up at him, a flicker of raw vulnerability crossing her features. "No one's touched me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The words seemed to escape of their own accord, a plain and unguarded truth she had no intention of sharing. It was not a statement about physical contact alone. It spoke of isolation, of the walls she had built, and of the simple kindness from a stranger that had just put a crack in them. Jonah Creed did not flinch. He did not look away or offer pity. He simply stood his ground, as solid as the earth beneath their feet. His hand, hanging loose at his side, didn't tremble. When he spoke, his voice was low and sure. "I don't need to touch something to know it's worth holding on to." His words hung in the space between them, heavy with a meaning she couldn't yet fathom. They were not a comfort, nor were they an advance. They were a fact, stated with the bare-knuckled simplicity of the desert. The sun bled out across the distant hills, staining the sky in streaks of orange and deep crimson. The last light of day enveloped their two figures, standing a horse's length apart. No promise was made, no understanding was reached. But there in the vast silence of Bitterroot Flats, something had begun. It was as quiet and unnamed as the land itself. But it was there, as fragile and tenacious as the first wildflower after a long drought. The water in the cistern at Cedar Hollow was low. You could see the dark, damp line on the stone wall that marked where the water level had been months ago, a sad reminder of a wetter, easier time. Now, the surface was still and murky, reflecting the hard blue sky with a dull resignation. Each bucket drawn was a careful, measured act. Jonah Creed kept the key to the small, locked shed where he stored the precious barrels he'd bought at the auction, not on his belt, but hanging on a nail on the porch post, in plain sight. It was a strange gesture in a thirsty land, part trust, part challenge, a silent declaration that what was his remained his by strength, not by concealment. For Eliza, the single barrel Jonah had given her was a temporary reprieve, not a solution. She rationed it spoonful by spoonful for the children, but the heat was relentless. One afternoon, the truth of their situation became unavoidable. A young boy named Owen Pike, his face flushed and his eyes glassy, simply slumped over his slate at his desk. He didn't cry out or fall. He just folded in on himself, a small plant finally succumbing to the lack of rain. Eliza was at his side in an instant, lifting his head, her hand cool on his feverish brow. The other children watched, their usual chatter silenced, their eyes wide with a fear that was older than they were. Owen was not ill. He was simply empty. After giving him the last of her personal water from a canteen, and seeing the life slowly return to his gaze, Eliza made a decision. She could not wait for the charity of others or the mercy of the sky. She had heard whispers of a place called Cottonmouth Creek. It was said to be on Creed's land, a stubborn trickle of water that refused to die, hidden deep in a rocky draw. After settling Owen with his older sister, Eliza locked the schoolhouse door, tied a bonnet firmly under her chin, and started walking east, following the wagon ruts that led toward Cedar Hollow. The sun beat down on her shoulders, and the dust rose in fine puffs around the hem of her dress. The world was shades of brown and bleached gold, and the silence was broken only by the hum of insects and the sound of her own breathing. She found him 3 miles later, not at the ranch but out on the range, mending a stretch of fence. He worked with an economy of motion, his hands sure and quick as he twisted the wire tight. He saw her coming from a long way off, a dark figure moving through the shimmering heat. He stopped his work and waited, one hand resting on a fence post, his posture betraying nothing. "Mr. Creed," she said, her voice a little breathless from the walk. He nodded once. "Ma'am." "I need to ask you for something, not as a gift," she added quickly, her pride a shield against the pity she saw in the eyes of so many others. "I want to make a bargain." He looked at her, his gray eyes narrowed against the sun. He didn't invite her to continue, but he didn't turn away. "I need water for the school, regularly," she said, her words plain and direct. "I've heard you have a creek on your land. I am willing to work for it." A flicker of something surprise perhaps passed through his eyes before the mask of indifference returned. "What kind of work?" "I was raised on a farm in Missouri. I know cattle. I can help with the branding or the mending, whatever you need." She saw his gaze drop to her hands, which, though clean, were not the calloused hands of a field worker. "I'm stronger than I look." Jonah was silent for a long moment. He looked past her, toward the low-slung buildings of his ranch in the distance. He was in the middle of calving season, and 2 of his best hands had left the week before, lured by the promise of wages at a silver mine to the north. He was stretched thin, "The new calves need watching," he said finally, his voice rough. "They're weak. They need to be kept from straying, guided to the water trough. It's tedious work, from sunup to sundown." "I can do it," she said, without hesitation. "1 barrel of water for 2 days' work," he stated. It was a hard bargain, but it was a bargain. "Agreed," Eliza said. Then she added, "And one more thing. I will teach your ranch hands to read and write in the evenings, as part of the arrangement." This time, he truly looked surprised. He turned his head and looked up at the vast, empty sky, as if the answer might be written there. Most ranchers didn't care if their men could read, as long as they could rope and ride. The offer was unexpected, an unnecessary complication. But he thought of the contracts he had to read aloud to them, the way their faces went blank at the sight of a printed page. He gave a short, sharp nod. "You'll need a place to stay. You can use the old foreman's cabin." And so the pact was sealed. Eliza moved her few belongings into the small, one-room cabin behind the main ranch house. It was sparse: a cot, a small table, a chair, but it was clean and sturdy. As she unpacked her valise, she pushed the sleeve of her dress up to wipe sweat from her brow. For a moment, a thin, white scar on the inside of her left wrist was visible, a delicate line against her skin, stark and out of place. She pulled her sleeve down quickly, a familiar, unconscious gesture. The next day, Jonah assigned her to the calving pen. As he was giving her instructions, he reached up to adjust a rope hanging from a rafter in the barn. His shirt lifted slightly, revealing a long, puckered scar that ran diagonally across his ribs, the mark of an old, deep wound. He seemed to feel her eyes on it and dropped his arm, his shirt falling back into place. Neither of them spoke of what they had seen. The scars were simply there, silent histories written on their skin, questions that would not be asked in a land that valued privacy above all else. A few days later, they had to ride into the small settlement of Dry Willow for supplies. The journey was mostly silent, the air filled only with the plodding of the horses and the creak of saddle leather. Dry Willow was little more than a general store and a blacksmith, but it served its purpose. They moved through the store with a shared, unspoken efficiency. Jonah picked up a heavy coil of rope and a large bag of salt. Eliza gathered twine and a new wick for the lamp in her cabin. As they prepared to leave, her eyes fell upon an object propped in a dusty corner, an old fiddle, its wood dark and scuffed, missing a string. It was a relic of a softer world, a thing of music and joy in a place defined by silence and work. She reached out and touched its curved body, a wistful look on her face. Jonah saw the gesture. He said nothing, but as the storekeeper was tallying their purchases, he walked back to the corner, picked up the fiddle, and placed it on the counter. "And this," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He paid for it all with a few coins from a leather pouch, and they left. The old fiddle now wrapped in a piece of sackcloth and tied to his saddle. That night, Eliza lay on her cot, the strange quiet of the ranch pressing in on her. It was a different silence from the town fuller, alive with the soft shuffling of cattle and the distant call of a coyote. She was just drifting off to sleep when she heard it hoofbeats. They were fast and urgent, not the slow, steady pace of a ranch horse returning to the barn. They sounded furtive, moving along the far edge of the property before fading into the night. She sat up, listening, her heart pounding, but the sound was gone, replaced once more by the familiar noises of the ranch. The next morning, the proof that she hadn't been dreaming was waiting. One of the ranch hands, a quiet man named Silas, found it. Stuck deep into the top of a fence post near the northern pasture was a knife. Its wooden hilt was painted a stark, garish red. It was the sign. The painted knives had been there. They had watched them. Jonah pulled the knife from the post. His face was like stone, his jaw tight. He held it for a moment, weighing it in his hand. then turned to Eliza, who had come to see what the commotion was about. He didn't have to say a word. The threat was clear, a silent scream in the morning light. That afternoon, Eliza rode back to the schoolhouse. The encounter had left a cold knot in her stomach, but as she stepped inside, the familiar scent of chalk dust and old paper calmed her. She picked up a fresh piece of chalk, its white fragility a stark contrast to the menacing red of the knife's hilt. She turned to the blackboard, its dark surface a canvas of possibility. Slowly, deliberately, she began to write the names of her students: Owen, Sarah, Caleb, Martha. With each name, her hand grew steadier. The fine white powder that fell from the chalk drifted down like a gentle, hopeful snow, a small promise of rain in a season of unending drought. Back at Cedar Hollow, as dusk settled over the valley, Jonah Creed walked into his house. He didn't light a lamp. He reached up to the high wooden rafters and took down a long, heavy rifle. It was a Whitworth, a prized possession, known for its accuracy at great distances. He didn't load it. He simply stood by the window in the growing darkness, holding the rifle, feeling its cool, solid weight in his hands. He checked the sight, his gaze fixed on the jagged silhouette of a distant ridge, a place the old maps called Devil's Paintbrush, his face a grim mask in the fading light. The world smelled of dust, hot leather, and the sour, earthy scent of cattle. The great, slow-moving river of longhorn steers flowed across the cracked land, a tide of bone and hide pushing toward the distant promise of the Silver Spur Depot. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the riders, raising a shimmering haze from the baked earth. Dust, fine as red flour, coated everything, filling the air, catching in the throat, and turning the sweat on their faces to mud. Jonah Creed rode at the head of the herd, a solitary figure against the vast, empty landscape. He moved with the rhythm of his horse, his body lean and taut, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the subtle language of the land. His few ranch hands, including the quiet Silas, fanned out on the flanks, their calls to the cattle sharp and clear in the dry air. Toward the rear of the drive, in a slightly less chaotic position, rode Eliza. She had insisted on coming. The cattle had to be sold, and Jonah couldn't spare a single man. She had a ledger book tied to her saddle horn to keep a tally of the herd, but her more immediate task was to watch over the small flock of children belonging to the hands. They rode on sturdy ponies, their small faces serious under the brims of their hats. Among them was Owen Pike, his fright from the schoolhouse replaced by a boy's quiet excitement. Eliza felt a fierce, protective instinct as she watched them, these small, tough blossoms in a hard country. She was their teacher, not just in letters, but in endurance. The morning wore on, measured not by the clock but by the slow crawl of shadows and the deepening thirst in their throats. The landscape was brutal in its monotony, endless stretches of withered grass and skeletal sagebrush under a sky that offered no hope of clouds. The only features were the distant, jagged ridges that cut into the horizon like broken teeth. It happened as the sun reached its zenith, burning directly overhead. A change came over the air. The wind, which had been a hot, steady breath, suddenly grew fickle, gusting and swirling in unpredictable eddies. Far to the west, the horizon began to blur, a smudge of darker red that grew with an unnatural speed. Jonah had seen it first. He reined in his horse, his body going still. He raised a hand, a signal that passed down the line of riders. "Storm!" Silas yelled, his voice thin against the rising wind. "Coming on fast!" There was no time to seek proper shelter. The world was dissolving into a maelstrom of red dust. The sun vanished, and the sky turned a sickening, angry ochre. The wind howled, a physical force that tore at their clothes and stung their eyes with sand. The world shrank to a few feet of swirling, choking chaos. The air grew thick and hard to breathe, tasting of grit and panic. The herd, already on edge from the heat and thirst, broke. The lowing of a few frightened steers turned into a collective roar of terror. The river of cattle became a stampede, a blind, thundering mass of hooves and horns moving with the storm. The shouts of the men were swallowed by the wind. Horses whinnied, their eyes rolling in fear. They were being driven toward a deep, rocky ravine that cut through the plains, a place where the earth simply fell away. In the blinding dust, the cattle wouldn't see it until it was too late. The lead steers would plunge over the edge, and the rest of the herd would follow, piling up in a tangle of death at the bottom. The ravine turned them. Jonah's voice was a raw command, barely audible above the gale. But the herd was deaf with fear. Eliza felt a surge of cold dread. She could see the terror on the faces of the children, their ponies struggling to keep their footing. She saw Owen's pony stumble, and the boy grabbed for the saddle horn, his knuckles white. This was how people died out here, consumed not by malice, but by the sheer, unthinking power of the land. Then she remembered. Tucked into her saddlebag was a small, brass whistle she used at the schoolhouse to call the children in from their play. It was a civilized sound, a thing of order and rules. On impulse, she pulled it free. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them steady, brought the whistle to her lips, and blew with all the air in her lungs. The sound that ripped through the storm was unlike anything else. It was not the organic roar of the wind or the thunder of the hooves. It was a high, piercing shriek, sharp as a needle, inhumanly clear. It cut through the chaos, a sliver of pure, piercing sound. The lead steers, already on the verge of the unseen cliff, heard it. The unfamiliar, painful noise sliced into their panic. They faltered, turning their heads away from the sound. A few turned sharply to the left, and then a few more. The shift was small, a slight change in the current, but it was enough. The deadly momentum that was carrying them toward the ravine was broken. The wave of terrified animals began to curve away from the precipice. A massive, shuddering turn back toward the relative safety of the open plain. Eliza blew the whistle again and again, the sharp notes a desperate beacon in the red gloom, until her lungs burned and her head swam. Slowly, as if the land itself were exhaling, the wind began to subside. The thickest of the dust cloud moved on, and the world began to reappear in ghostly shapes. The ravine was terrifyingly close, a jagged wound in the earth just yards from where the edge of the herd had been. And through the thinning haze, they appeared. 3 riders, sitting their horses like statues on a low rise. They were dark silhouettes against the swirling dust, their forms indistinct, almost spectral. But as the air cleared, the details sharpened. They were hard-faced men, their eyes narrowed slits. And on the saddle of the foremost rider, a knife was tucked into his belt, its hilt gleaming with a fresh, defiant coat of red paint. The painted knives. A cold, different kind of silence fell over Jonah's party. The fear of the storm was replaced by the fear of men. Jonah's hand moved, not in a hurry, but with a cold, deliberate grace. His Colt revolver seemed to leap into his palm. He didn't aim at the men. He raised the pistol and fired a single, deafening shot. The bullet screamed past the riders and struck something beyond them. There was a sharp twang. On the far side of the rise, an old, rusted flagpole stood, a relic from some long-forgotten survey mission. The bullet had hit the wire stay, and the high-pitched vibration of the impact carried back to them on the wind, a sound like a single, angry nerve being plucked. It was a warning shot, but it was also a statement of terrifying accuracy. The leader of the raiders stared, his face unreadable. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the whistle that turned the herd, and he hadn't expected the shot that spoke of a skill far beyond that of a simple rancher. The standoff was broken by a child's cry. Owen Pike's pony, still spooked, suddenly reared up. The boy, small and light, lost his grip. He slid sideways, one foot catching in the stirrup as he began to fall. He was about to be dragged, to be trampled. Eliza didn't think. She spurred her horse forward, a desperate, lunging movement. She threw herself from the saddle while her mount was still moving, landing hard and sliding through the coarse sand. She ignored the searing pain as the ground tore at her dress and the skin of her knee. She scrambled forward on her hands and one good leg, reaching Owen just as his pony bolted. She grabbed the boy's arm, her grip like iron, and hauled him free of the stirrup. She pulled him close, shielding his small body with her own as the panicked pony galloped away. The sight seemed to break the spell. The raiders had seen enough. This was not the easy, vulnerable target they had anticipated. The leader gave a curt nod to his men. Without a word, they wheeled their horses around and galloped away, their forms quickly swallowed by the remaining haze. As they vanished over the rise, a small, dark object fell from one of their saddlebags, unnoticed. Eliza pushed herself to a sitting position, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood was seeping through a long tear in her skirt, staining the fabric dark. Owen was crying, not from injury but from sheer terror. She held him tight, murmuring soothing words, her own heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Jonah was at her side in an instant, his face a grim mask of concern. He knelt, his eyes going from her torn knee to the boy huddled in her arms. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low.
"Just a scrape,"
she said, though her knee was screaming in protest.
"Owen is safe."
Silas retrieved the boy's pony, and soon Owen was safely back with his father, who held him in a fierce, trembling hug. Jonah helped Eliza to her feet. She leaned on him for a moment, a wave of dizziness washing over her. His arm was solid and steady around her waist. It was Silas who found the bundle. He rode over the rise where the raiders had been and came back holding a small square of oilcloth tied with a leather thong. He handed it to Jonah. Jonah untied the knot and spread the cloth open. Inside was a hand-drawn map, crude but detailed. It showed the very terrain they were in, but it also showed a narrow, hidden trail leading through the ridges, a shortcut that ended at a place marked Wolf Canyon. Jonah stared at the map, his jaw tight.
"They're scouting,"
he said, his voice flat and hard.
"Learning the land, finding the weak spots."
He looked at Eliza, and his eyes held a grim understanding. The knife on the fence post hadn't been an idle threat. It was a prelude. Eliza looked from the map to the children, now gathered together, their faces pale. She met Jonah's gaze, her own eyes clear and resolute despite the pain in her leg.
"Then we'll teach fear its letters, too,"
she said softly. That night, they made a cold camp. There would be no fire to attract unwanted attention. The cattle, exhausted, settled down quickly. The air grew cool, and the sky, swept clean by the storm, was a vast expanse of black velvet strewn with countless stars. They glittered with a cold, hard brilliance, like filings of iron scattered across the dark. They took turns standing watch, 2 at a time. The silence of the night was immense, broken only by the soft breathing of the herd and the occasional lonely call of a night bird. When it was Eliza's turn to watch with Jonah, they sat propped against their saddles, a rifle across each of their laps. The pain in her knee had settled into a dull, persistent throb. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, in the deep quiet, a new sound emerged, hesitant and fragile. The notes of a fiddle drifted through the darkness. One of the hands, a young man who had said barely 2 words all day, was playing the old instrument Jonah had bought. He wasn't a skilled player. The tune was simple, the notes sometimes wavering and uncertain, but it was music. It was a small, human sound pushed back against the vast, indifferent darkness. It was the sound of a heart beating when it had every reason to be still with fear. Jonah and Eliza listened, side by side in the starlight. The halting music was a question mark in the night, a sound as vulnerable and as stubborn as the people huddled together in the middle of the unforgiving land. The stars burned fiercely above and down below, in the immense and dangerous darkness. Neither of them slept very deeply at all. The big barn at Cedar Hollow had never known such a thing. By day, it was a place of work, smelling of hay, animals, and honest sweat. But tonight, it was being transformed. The harsh angles and deep shadows were softened by the warm, flickering glow of a dozen oil lanterns. Jonah's men, Silas and the others, moved with a quiet, unaccustomed purpose, hanging the lanterns from the high rafters on lengths of rope. Their movements were careful, as if they were handling something fragile, which, in a way, they were. They were handling hope. Eliza moved among them, a small whirlwind of focused energy. She had found a pile of old burlap sacks, and with a pair of shears and a needle, she was turning the rough, humble fabric into something beautiful. She twisted strips into garlands to loop between the support posts and fashioned clumsy, charming rosettes to hide the rust stains on the walls. It was a small, defiant act of creation in a world that had been defined for so long by relentless decay. She was coaxing beauty from dust and determination. This was her idea, born from the success of her evening lessons. The ranch hands, at first shy and resistant, had slowly begun to embrace the magic of letters. To see your own name take shape under your hand was a kind of power, a way of staking a claim on the world. And so, the literacy hoedown was born. The rule was simple and served as both a goal and a reward. Anyone who could write their own name on the big slate by the door would have the honor of the first dance. As people began to arrive, a nervous energy filled the barn. They came on foot and on horseback from the few neighboring ranches that hadn't yet been abandoned. They were worn, tired people, not accustomed to celebration. The women wore their best faded calico dresses, and the men had scrubbed their faces until they shone. Their clean shirts stiff and unfamiliar, they gathered in small, awkward clusters, their voices low, the habit of conserving energy and emotion hard to break. But the children, as always, were the bridge. They ran through the clean-swept barn, their laughter echoing in the high-ceilinged space. They chased each other through the golden shafts of lantern light, their small boots scuffing up the sweet-smelling dust from the floor. And they were drawn, like moths to a flame, to the large chalkboard Eliza had propped against a stack of hay bales. One by one, she called them forward. Young Sarah, her tongue stuck out in concentration, carefully drew the letters of her name, the chalk squeaking in the quiet barn. When she finished, a smudged but triumphant Sarah looked back at her. A smattering of applause broke out, and the girl beamed, her face radiating a pride that was worth more than a good harvest. Then Caleb, then Martha, then it was Owen Pike's turn. He walked to the slate with a new confidence, picked up the chalk, and wrote Owen in big, bold letters. He turned to find Eliza's eyes, and she gave him a smile that made his chest puff out. Even a few of the men shuffled forward. Silas, his face grim with focus, gripped the chalk in his thick, calloused fingers. He painstakingly formed the letters of his name, his hand more used to the heft of a branding iron than the delicacy of a writing instrument. When he was done, he stepped back and stared at the name Silas as if he were seeing himself for the first time. Jonah did not participate. He stood apart from the small crowd. His shoulder leaned against a massive wooden post at the edge of the light. One boot crossed over the other. From this vantage point, he watched everything, his face in shadow, his presence a quiet, grounding force. He was not a man for parties. He was a man of fences and ledgers, of calculating risks and enduring hardships. This small bubble of light and laughter was a foreign country to him. But his eyes were fixed on Eliza. He watched the way the lantern light caught the stray strands of hair that had escaped her bun, turning them to threads of gold. He watched the way she knelt to speak to a small child, her expression one of utter, unfeigned delight. He watched the way she moved, with a purpose and a grace that seemed to defy the heavy, weary air of the valley. A genuine smile touched her lips as she praised a ranch hand's clumsy attempt at writing his name, and in that moment, she was the most vibrant thing Jonah had ever seen. The faint sheen of perspiration on her temples, catching the light as she turned her head, looked less like sweat and more like a scattering of tiny, captured stars, a strange, Unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had long since buried under layers of duty and loss. She was building something here, something more than a party. She was building a community. The young hand who had played the fiddle on the cattle drive, a boy named Jesse, had brought the instrument with him, now, sitting on a hay bale. He drew his bow across the strings. The music that filled the barn was not refined, but it was real. It was a slow, simple waltz, a melody that spoke of wide-open spaces and quiet heartaches. It was music made for worn leather boots on a wooden floor. "First dancers," Eliza called out, her voice bright, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Those who had passed their test stepped onto the open floor. Owen Pike gravely took his mother's hand. Silas, his face flushed, bowed awkwardly to his wife. They began to move, their steps clumsy at first, but slowly finding the rhythm of the music. Their feet, so used to the unforgiving, cracked earth, now found a moment of lightness. Their bodies, so often bent with labor, now straightened with a simple, human joy. The music seemed to connect them, a thread weaving through the lonely spaces that separated their lives, binding them together in a shared moment of grace. The first song ended, and another began. More couples joined the floor. The barn was filled with the soft shuffle of boots, the murmur of voices, and the lonely, sweet song of the fiddle. Jonah remained at his post, a silent guardian of this fragile peace. He had no intention of joining. He was the watcher, the provider, the rock against which the hardships of this life broke. That was his place. Then he saw her walking toward him. Eliza moved through the dancers, her path direct, her eyes on him. She stopped just before him, the warm light from a nearby lantern illuminating one side of her face. "Mr. Creed," she said, her voice soft but clear over the music. "They're playing my favorite tune." It wasn't, but he didn't know that. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the shifting shadows. He simply nodded, expecting her to move on. She didn't. "I'm not much of a dancer," she said, a small, almost shy smile playing on her lips. It was an invitation, gently offered. He thought of all the reasons to refuse. He was not a dancer. He was not a part of this. His place was in the darkness, on the edge of things. But then he looked into her eyes, and he saw not a challenge, but a simple request for a shared moment. "Neither am I," he heard himself say, his own voice sounding rusty to his ears. He pushed himself off the post, unfolding to his full height. He looked down at their feet, then back at her. "But I'm steady on my feet." It was the truth. In a world that was constantly shifting, crumbling, and threatening to give way, Jonah Creed was steady. Eliza placed her hand on his outstretched arm. Her touch was light, but he felt it like a brand through the coarse fabric of his shirt. He placed his other hand tentatively on the small of her back, feeling the warmth and the surprising strength there. And then they were moving. They stepped out onto the floor, into the gentle river of music and people. Their steps were slow, careful, a negotiation of the unfamiliar space between them. He was stiff, awkward, his body not used to this kind of movement, but she followed his lead with a quiet grace, her presence a calming influence. The dust on the floor, stirred by their feet and the feet of the others, rose in a fine haze, catching the lantern light in swirling patterns. For a fleeting, magical moment, it looked like a gentle snowfall in the middle of summer. He looked down at the top of her head, at the intricate coil of her hair, and breathed in the faint, clean scent of soap and woman. For the first time in a very long time, Jonah Creed was not thinking about the drought, or the cattle, or the ever-present threat that lurked in the hills. He was thinking only of the woman in his arms. Thwack! The sound was sharp, violent, and utterly alien. It cut through the music, through the laughter, through the warm, communal spell. The fiddle stopped with a screech of a wrong note. Every head turned. There, quivering in the side of the large water barrel near the entrance, was a knife. Its hilt was painted a stark, vicious red. The lantern, disturbed by the sudden shift of air from the open door, swayed on their ropes, casting wild, dancing shadows that turned familiar faces into grotesque masks. A collective gasp went through the room. Outside, in the sudden, ringing silence, they all heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats, fast and hard, galloping away into the darkness. A woman screamed, a short, sharp sound that was quickly stifled. The painted knives had come to the party. They hadn't attacked. They had simply delivered an invitation of their own. An invitation to be afraid. The spell was broken. The warmth in the barn was instantly replaced by a spreading, icy chill. People backed away from the entrance, pulling their children close. Fear, the constant, unwelcome guest in their lives, had just kicked down the door and made itself at home. Through it all, Jonah did not let go of Eliza. As the knife struck the barrel, his hand instinctively tightened on hers. It wasn't a convulsive, fearful grab. It was a firm, grounding pressure, a silent communication of strength. His hand, she noted with a sense of distant wonder, did not tremble. His body had gone rigid, his focus instantly shifting from the dance floor to the darkness outside. But there was no tremor of fear in him. He looked down at her, his gray eyes hard as flint. "They want to see us afraid," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. It wasn't a statement of defeat. It was an assessment of the enemy's strategy. Eliza looked from his face to the knife. The red hilt was like a drop of blood against the dark wood of the barrel. The symbol was meant to paralyze, to scatter them back to their isolated homes, to remind them that they were vulnerable and alone. But she was not alone. She felt the steady strength of Jonah's hand holding hers. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled her hand free. She walked the few steps to the water barrel, the crowd parting before her as if she were walking through water. She reached out, her fingers closing around the rough wooden hilt of the knife. It was stuck deep in the wood. She had to brace her other hand against the barrel and pull hard. It came free with a sucking sound. She stood there for a moment, holding the weapon. It felt ugly and heavy in her hand. Then, with a calm resolve that surprised even herself, she reached into the small pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, white linen handkerchief. It was her best one, carefully ironed, with a delicate, embroidered E in one corner. Holding the knife firmly, she began to wipe the blade clean with the handkerchief. Methodically, she scrubbed at the red paint on the hilt, her motions precise and unhurried. She wiped away the symbol of their fear, smearing the white linen with the crude, red paint until the handle was nothing but plain wood again. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at the open door. She focused only on this one small, defiant act, cleaning the violation from their lives, refusing to let the stain remain. When she was finished, she held the clean knife in one hand and the ruined handkerchief in the other. She turned and looked at Jonah. He was watching her, his expression one she had never seen before, a mixture of awe and a fierce, protective pride. The party was over, but in its ruins, they stood together. No longer just a rancher and a schoolteacher, but two people bound by a shared refusal to break. The new threat did not arrive with the howl of the wind or the thunder of hooves. It came on the noon stagecoach, in the form of a man named Calder Nix. He stepped out into the oppressive heat of Red Mesa Crossing, not as a man of the West, but as a man who intended to own it. He wore a dark wool suit that should have been stifling, but on him looked merely formal, a sign of his complete indifference to the climate. His boots were polished to a high sheen, and the dust seemed afraid to settle on them. He was the chief representative of the Mid-Prairie Rail Company, and he carried a leather portfolio full of papers that were, in their own way, more dangerous than any gun. He did not go to the saloon. He went to the makeshift town hall, and within an hour, the whispers started. The railroad was coming through. not near the valley, but through it, and the railroad needed water. A new kind of murmur trickled through the town, different from the fear of the painted knives. It was a nervous, excited hum of opportunity, of jobs, of a connection to the world beyond the dust. With this excitement came a darker, quieter rumor, one that passed between men in the shadows of the livery stable. The painted knives had grown bolder just as the railroad's interest in the valley grew stronger. It seemed too neat a coincidence. People began to wonder if the company's survey teams weren't the only ones clearing a path for the Iron Horse. Perhaps the railroad employed specters with red-painted knives to do the kind of work that couldn't be recorded in a ledger. Calder Nix was a patient man. He spent 2 days speaking with the town's small council, with the merchants, with anyone who held a deed, and then he came to the schoolhouse. Eliza saw him coming from the window. He walked with a long, confident stride, his dark suit an aggressive anomaly in the sun-bleached landscape. She dismissed the children early, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. He stopped at the door, removed his hat, and smiled. It was a perfect smile, his teeth startlingly white and even against his tanned skin. "Miss Marlowe," he said, his voice smooth and educated. "I am Calder Nix. I hope I am not interrupting your important work." "The children have gone home for the day. Mr. Nix," she replied, her tone polite but cool. She did not invite him in. "Excellent. Then perhaps you have a moment. I have come to admire your efforts here. To bring education to a place like this, it is a truly noble endeavor." He gestured vaguely at the dusty street, as if it were a specimen under glass. "It is necessary work," she said simply. "Indeed, and necessary work should be properly supported." He stepped past her into the small, hot room, his presence seeming to shrink the space. His eyes took in everything: the crude benches, the worn slates, the single water barrel in the corner. "Which brings me to my proposal. The Mid-Prairie Rail Company believes in investing in the communities we serve. We believe in progress, and progress begins with children." He paused, letting his words settle. "We are prepared to fund the drilling of a new, deep well, exclusively for this schoolhouse. No more rationing, no more watching your pupils suffer from the heat. A permanent, reliable source of fresh water." Eliza stared at him, her heart giving a sudden, painful leap. A well. It was the answer to her prayers, a dream she hadn't even dared to fully form. She thought of Owen Pike, wilting at his desk. She thought of the desperate auction, of the long walks for a single barrel. "Why?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. "What do you want in return?" Calder's smile widened. "A simple thing. We need a local clerk, someone to help manage our land use contracts, our payroll for the local labor we intend to hire. Someone literate, organized, and respected. Someone like you. Miss Marlowe. It would be a secretarial position. Of course. Well compensated. Naturally. Your work here at the school could continue unimpeded." The offer hung in the air, polished and perfect. It was a clean solution, a benevolent bargain. He was offering her the very thing she needed most, wrapped in the respectable guise of employment. But as she looked at him, at his easy confidence and watchful eyes, a cold feeling washed over her. It felt less like an offer and more like the first move in a complicated game she didn't understand. "I will have to think about it," she said, her voice more non-committal than she felt. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Take all the time you need. Progress is inevitable, Miss Marlowe. But it is always pleasant when it is welcomed by intelligent people." He placed a sheaf of papers on her desk. "A preliminary draft of the school's funding agreement. For your consideration." He tipped his hat and was gone, leaving the scent of bay rum and money in the dusty air. The inevitable confrontation with Jonah came the next day. Calder Nix, accompanied by 2 of the town's councilmen, rode out to Cedar Hollow. Jonah met them in the yard, not inviting them onto the porch. He stood with his feet planted, his hands loose at his sides, looking as rooted and immovable as the ancient oak tree that shaded the house. Mr. Creed," Calder began, his tone affable. "A pleasure to finally meet the man who owns the heart of this valley." Jonah said nothing. "As you've no doubt heard, the Mid-Prairie Rail Company is coming. We are prepared to make a generous offer for a section of your northern pasture and for exclusive rights to the water from Cottonmouth Creek. We will pay a price far above the current market value." Jonah's gaze was steady. "The land is not for sale. The water is not for sale." Calder's smile did not falter. He glanced at the parched ground, at the distant, thirsty cattle. "Mr. Creed, let us be practical. This is a historic opportunity. The railroad will bring prosperity. It will raise the value of all this land. To refuse is short-sighted. The railroad will bring what it brings," Jonah said, his voice a low rumble. "But it won't be bringing it through my land." The friendliness in Calder Nix's eyes hardened. Though his smile remained fixed in place, it was a smile utterly devoid of warmth, a mere baring of teeth that were as white and smooth as river-worn pebbles. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Creed. It is merely a matter of finding the right price. The company is authorized to secure the necessary right-of-way, one way or another. I suggest you reconsider my generous offer before you are forced to accept a less pleasant alternative." He turned his horse and rode away, the councilmen trailing in his wake like nervous pilot fish. The town meeting a few days later was held in the evening, but the heat of the day lingered inside the clapboard walls of the town hall, magnified by the press of anxious bodies and the light of a dozen lanterns. The air was thick and hard to breathe, hot as a blacksmith's forge. The valley had split down the middle. On one side were the ranchers like Jonah and a few old families who saw the railroad not as progress, but as an invasion. On the other were the merchants, the blacksmith, and the farmers whose wells had run dry, their eyes gleaming with the promise of railroad money and the hope of an easier life. Calder Nix stood at the front of the room, calm and poised in the center of the storm he had created. He spoke of jobs, of growth, of a future where Red Mesa Crossing was not a forgotten speck on the map, but a vital hub of commerce. He painted a picture so seductive that men were willing to trade their freedom for a place within its frame. "He's right," shouted a farmer whose land had turned to a dust bowl. "We're dying out here. Creed can afford to be proud, sitting on the only running water in the county." "It's his water," another man yelled back. "His family was here before any of us." The room erupted in a cacophony of angry, fearful voices. They were arguing with each other, but their fight was really with the land, with the drought, with their own dwindling hope. Eliza stood near the back, caught in the crossfire. Her mind was a turmoil. She looked at the desperate, angry faces and saw their children in her classroom, their small bodies listless from the heat. Calder's offer echoed in her head, a permanent, reliable source of fresh water. It was a clean, simple answer to a brutal, complicated problem. But then she looked at Jonah. He stood against the far wall, his arms crossed, his face set like stone. He was not just defending a creek, he was defending a principle, the idea that a man's life and land were his own, not a commodity to be bought and sold by a distant, powerful entity. She was trapped between the immediate, desperate needs of the children and the abstract, vital sovereignty of a man's soul. The meeting solved nothing. It only deepened the cracks in the community, leaving behind a bitter residue of resentment and suspicion. That night, back in the quiet solitude of her cabin at the ranch, Eliza could not sleep. The arguments from the town hall replayed in her mind. She lit a lamp and picked up the papers Calder Nix had left her. She read through the funding agreement, the legal language dense and unfamiliar, but it was all there, in black and white, the promise of a well, funded entirely by the Mid-Prairie Rail Company. She ran her finger over the impressive-looking wax seal at the bottom of the page, the company's insignia pressed into the deep red wax. As her finger traced the edge, A small piece of the seal crumbled away, not cleanly, but in a dry, gritty powder. Curious, she held it closer to the lamp. The wax was brittle, not pliable like proper sealing wax. Using the tip of a small penknife, she carefully pried at the edge. The entire seal lifted off the page with a soft crackle. Beneath it, the paper was not indented as it should have been. There was no impression from the stamp. It was just a flat surface with a faint, oily residue. It was a fake, a convincing, but ultimately hollow, imitation of a legal bond. They were not offering a contract, they were offering an illusion. Miles away, in the same moonlight, Jonah was walking the fence line of his northern pasture. He had felt a deep unease since his meeting with Nix, a sense that the threat was no longer a distant negotiation, but something immediate and physical. He saw it near a stand of cottonwoods that marked the edge of his property, a small, wooden stake, freshly driven into the ground. It was painted bright orange at the top. He walked another 100 yards and found another, and then another. They formed a straight, unyielding line, cutting directly across his land, aimed straight for Cottonmouth Creek. The railroad surveyors had been there. They had marked their path, an act of silent, arrogant trespass. They were not waiting for his permission. The next afternoon, as Eliza was sweeping the floor of the empty schoolhouse, a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up, but no one was there. Then she saw it on the floor, a piece of folded paper that had been slid under the door. Her breath caught in her throat. She picked it up with trembling fingers. The paper was coarse, the handwriting a crude, blocky script. It contained only 4 words. "Choose a side, teacher." She stood there in the silent schoolhouse, the anonymous threat clutched in her hand. The world, which had once seemed a simple matter of right and wrong, of hardship and endurance, had become a treacherous place of hidden meanings and calculated threats. The lines were being drawn. That night, a sliver of a moon rose in the sky, its edge as sharp and cold as the blade of a knife. The wind had died down, and the silence that fell over the valley was heavy and watchful. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant snap of a twig, sounded like the click of a hammer being cocked, like the whisper of steel being drawn from a sheath. The wind began its low moan just after sunset. It was not the violent, tearing gust of a sudden storm, but a slow, rising lament that scraped across the valley floor. Dust, fine and gritty, began to seep through the invisible cracks in the cabin walls, coating the rough wooden table with a pale film. Outside, the world was slowly being erased by a brown haze. Eliza sat at the small table in her cabin, the anonymous note lying before her. "Choose a side. Teacher." The 4 words were a brand, searing themselves into her mind. She had folded and unfolded the paper so many times the creases were soft as cloth. It was the same choice she had been given before, though in a different form, a choice that was not a choice at all. She hadn't realized Jonah had entered until he set a tin cup of coffee on the table beside her hand. She started a small, sharp intake of breath. He moved with a silence that was part of his nature, a way of conserving himself, of leaving as small a footprint on the world as possible. He took the only other chair, the lamplight carving deep shadows into the angles of his face. He didn't speak, just sat, his presence a quiet, questioning weight in the small room. The note lay between them. He didn't look at it, but he knew. He could see the fear in the tight set of her shoulders, in the way she held her hands clasped in her lap. "It's the railroad," she said finally, her voice sounding thin and distant against the rising wail of the wind. "They think they can buy anything, or scare it away. They're used to getting their way," Jonah said. His voice was a low rumble, a counterpoint to the wind's high shriek.
"I've known men like that,"
she whispered, her gaze dropping to her own hands. Without thinking, her thumb stroked the inside of her left wrist, tracing a line that only she could feel. The gesture was small, private, but in the intense quiet of the cabin, it was as loud as a shout. Jonah's eyes followed the movement. He had seen the scar before, a faint, white line she always kept half hidden by her sleeve. He had never asked. Scars were a private language out here, and he did not pry. But tonight, the story behind it seemed to fill the space between them. The words came from her as if she were breathing them out, a long, slow sigh of a story she had held in for years. "It's from Missouri," she began, her voice barely audible. "From a wedding that never happened." She told him of a young man with a charming smile and restless eyes, a man who worked as a guard for a railroad expansion company. She spoke of promises made under an eastern sky full of soft, fat clouds, a sky that knew nothing of this brutal, endless blue. She had believed him. She had believed in the small house he described, in the future he painted with easy, confident words. "His name was Martin," she said, and the name sounded strange on her lips, a word from a foreign language. "He was in debt, gambling. I found out later, deep in debt to a man who owned a large freighting company, a man with a cruel mouth and heavy hands." The wind slammed a handful of sand against the window pane, a sound like a sudden rattle of claws. Eliza flinched but did not stop. "We were to be married on a Sunday. On the Friday before, Martin took me to see the land he said he'd bought for us. But it wasn't his land. It belonged to the other man, his creditor. It was remote, miles from any town." Her voice grew flatter, colder, as if she were stripping all emotion from the memory just to be able to survive telling it. "Martin didn't sell the land. He sold me. An arrangement had been made. My services. In exchange for clearing his debt." Jonah's stillness was absolute. He didn't move a muscle, but a darkness gathered in his eyes, a storm more violent than the one raging outside. "The other man was there. He laughed. He said I had fine, educated hands." She looked down at her hands, clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "Martin wouldn't look at me. He just stood there while the other man grabbed my arm. I pulled away. There was a struggle. I fell, and my wrist was cut on a piece of broken tack, a buckle on a harness lying on the ground. It was sharp." She fell silent, the memory of the sharp edge, the sudden, bright pain filling the cabin. That night, a blizzard came, one of those sudden, blinding storms. No one expected it. In the confusion, with them drinking to celebrate their bargain, I just ran, out into the snow, with nothing but the dress I was wearing. The cold was a kind of clarity. It burned everything else away. I walked until I found a road. I swore to myself then, in the middle of all that white nothing, that no one would ever touch me again unless I chose it, unless I was the one to reach out first." She finished her story, and the silence that followed was profound. The only sound was the wind, scouring the world clean. Jonah's gaze was fixed on the old kettle sitting on the small cast-iron stove in the corner. The stove was cold, but the kettle was a solid, dark shape in the dim light. Slowly, deliberately, he stood up, walked to the stove, and placed his right hand flat on the kettle's rounded surface. Eliza watched, confused. A tremor ran through his arm. His hand was shaking, not with a violent shudder, but with a deep, contained vibration, as if he were holding onto a live wire. He was not warming his hand on a cold stove. He was pressing down on it, grounding himself, using the solid, unyielding iron to stop himself from shaking apart. The gesture was one of immense control. A man fighting a war within himself and using a simple, physical anchor to keep from being consumed. The heat he felt was not from the stove. It was the rage burning inside him. A rage on her behalf that was so powerful it threatened to break his legendary stillness. He took a deep breath, and the tremor subsided. He removed his hand from the kettle and turned back to her, his face a mask of iron control, but his eyes held the lingering fire. He walked back to the table and sat down. "I had a brother," he said, his voice rough. He was offering a story for a story, a scar for a scar. His name was Samuel. He was younger than me by 5 years, full of foolish talk and easy laughter. He paused, looking at the rough wood grain of the table as if the memories were stored there. It was during the first big drought, 10 years back. It was worse than this one. We were just boys, trying to hold this place together after our father passed. We ran out of water, completely. The well went dry. Then the cistern, the creek. It was just a line of cracked mud. We heard there was water to be had north, near the mountains. We took the horses and went looking for it. His voice dropped lower. We didn't find it. We got lost in the heat. The horses gave out. We started walking. After a day, Samuel couldn't go on. The thirst. It does things to a man's mind. He started seeing things, rivers, lakes. He tried to run toward them. I had to hold him down. Jonah fell silent, his throat working.
He died in my arms. He was so light, he just faded. His last word was water.
The confession lay in the air. A grief so old and so deep it felt like part of the foundation of the house itself. I buried him out there, Jonah continued, his voice barely a whisper. Then I walked back. I don't know how. When the rains finally came that winter, the first place I went was to Cottonmouth Creek. I watched the water start to trickle back over the rocks. I made a promise to him then, that as long as I was alive, this water would never be owned by anyone else, that it would always be here for those who needed it, keeping that creek safe. It's the same as tending his grave. Now Eliza understood. His fight with the railroad, his stubborn refusal to sell. It wasn't about land or money or pride. It was a sacred trust. It was his last conversation with his brother. The wind hit the cabin with a sudden, violent gust, rattling the door in its frame as if trying to get in. The force of it seemed to push the very air in the room, pressing them closer together, though neither had moved. They were two people in a small wooden box, with a storm of sand and memory raging outside and in. Jonah looked at her, and the distance between them had vanished. They were no longer just a rancher and a schoolteacher. They were two survivors, each marked by their own desert. He saw the faint, white line on her wrist, and she saw the ghost of a dead boy in his eyes. Slowly, he raised his hand, the one that had trembled with rage. He did not reach for her. He simply opened it, palm up, on the table between them. It was a big hand, calloused and scarred from years of hard labor, but it was open, vulnerable. A question.
If I were to touch you,
he said, his voice quiet but clear over the storm. It would be to ask. He wasn't making a demand. He was offering her back the choice that had been stolen from her in the snows of Missouri. Eliza looked at his open hand. She looked at the lifeline etched into his palm, at the strength and the sorrow held there. She took a breath, a shuddering intake of air that was the first truly free breath she'd taken in years, and then, slowly, with a will and a deliberation that was all her own, she reached out. She did not give him her good hand. She offered him the other one. She placed her left wrist, with its pale, silvery scar, into the center of his palm. It was an answer, an agreement as small and as momentous as the first drop of rain after a long drought. His fingers curled around her wrist, his thumb coming to rest gently, almost reverently, right over the scar. His skin was warm, a living, breathing heat that seemed to seep through her own. It did not erase the mark. The scar did not magically vanish, but for the first time, the memory it held did not sting. The ache that lived deep in the bone, the phantom pain of betrayal and fear, began to recede under the simple, steady warmth of his touch. Outside, the storm began to pass. The howling of the wind gentled into a sigh. In the ensuing quiet, a new sound became audible, carried from a great distance on the cleared air. It was faint, mournful, and lonely. The whistle of a train, somewhere far to the east, cutting through the night like a warning. The tip came from a boy, no older than 16, who rode into Cedar Hollow after dark on a lathered, trembling horse. He worked for a small rancher to the south, a man who had spoken in favor of the railroad at the town meeting. The boy's eyes were wide with fear and a shame that fought with his urgency. He told Jonah, in a hushed, stumbling whisper, that he'd overheard his boss talking with two strangers. He'd heard the words calves, Wolf Canyon, and First Light, and he'd heard them laugh about how the painted knives were earning their pay from the railroad. He had ridden out as soon as his boss was asleep, risking a thrashing, or worse. Jonah listened without a word, his face as still and hard as the dark granite of the hills. When the boy was finished, Jonah simply nodded, told Silas to give him a fresh horse from his own stable, and sent him on his way into the darkness, a silent pact of protection passing between them. There was no time for the law. The law was in Red Mesa Crossing, sleeping in its bed, maybe dreaming of railroad money. The only law here was the one you made yourself in the cold hours before dawn. Jonah's plan was born of a hunter's logic. You present the prey with the bait it expects to see. He gathered his few hands, Silas and Jesse among them. In the flickering lantern light of the barn, his voice was low, devoid of emotion, each word a hard, practical stone laid in place. They would create a ghost herd. In the bone-chilling dark before sunrise, they worked. They stretched 2 long tarps between a dozen of the older, slower steers. From a distance in the poor light, the dark canvas would look like the solid mass of a much larger herd. They tied cowbells, their clappers muffled with rags for now. To the necks of these decoy animals, this ghost herd would take the main trail, the wide, obvious path that led directly toward the ambush site. Jesse, the young hand with the fiddle, and 2 others would drive them. Their job was not to fight, but to make noise and then scatter when the trouble started. The real herd, the young, valuable calves, would be taken by Jonah, Silas, and Eliza. They would take the longer, more treacherous route that looped south before cutting back through the narrow, winding passage of Wolf Canyon. It was a gamble, a bet that their enemy's arrogance would make them blind. Eliza was given a sawed-off shotgun. It was heavy and brutally simple. As she took it from Silas, she felt its cold, dense weight. It was a tool, like a hoe or an axe, but its purpose was singular and final. She loaded the 2 shells, the brass smooth and cool against her fingers. Her hands were steady. It was a strange, unnerving calm. She thought of Jonah, of his unshakable stillness in the face of chaos. It was as if she had absorbed some of it through his touch, a transfusion of resolve. Her gaze was clear, her eyes holding no illusion about what the morning might bring. She would not be a liability. Young Owen Pike, whose father was riding with the decoy herd, had been placed in her charge. The boy would ride beside her. She was not just protecting cattle. They moved out as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky. The air was cold and sharp in the lungs, carrying the smells of dust, sage, and nervous animals. The 2 groups split at the edge of the property, the ghost herd lumbering off with the muffled clanking of their bells, while the smaller, quieter group of calves melted into the shadows of the southern hills. The journey to the mouth of Wolf Canyon was tense and silent. Every rock formation looked like a man with a rifle. Every gust of wind sounded like a horse. Owen rode close to Eliza, his small face pale, his eyes wide. She reached out and briefly squeezed his shoulder, a small gesture of reassurance she felt as much as he did. They reached the canyon as the sun's first rays struck the tops of the highest ridges, painting them a bloody orange. Wolf Canyon was a deep, narrow scar in the earth, its rock walls rising steeply on both sides. The trail was barely wide enough for 2 horses to pass. It was a natural trap. They were halfway through when the world was ripped apart. It was not the crack of a rifle. It was a deep, earth-shattering boom that slammed into them. A physical blow of sound and pressure. A section of the canyon wall high above them erupted in a flash of white light. Smoke and flying rock. Dynamite. The boulders, some as large as a wagon, crashed down onto the trail ahead, completely blocking their path. The air was instantly choked with the acrid, chemical stench of sulfur and hot rock. A fine, gritty dust rained down, stinging their eyes and coating their tongues. The explosion's echo slammed back and forth between the canyon walls, a deafening, rolling thunder. The calves, already nervous, screamed with terror. They bolted, turning back on themselves, a panicked, stampeding mass in the confined space. Their small hooves struck sparks from the stones on the canyon floor. The smell of their fear was a sharp, musky tang in the air, mingling with the sulfur. A stray piece of shrapnel from the blast had grazed the flank of one calf, and the smell of singed hair and flesh was suddenly, sickeningly present. Through the dust and chaos, figures appeared on the rim of the canyon above them, the painted knives. There were 5 of them, silhouetted against the morning sky. "Nowhere to run! Creed!" a voice roared, magnified by the canyon's acoustics. Jonah and Silas had their rifles out, firing up at the ridge, the shots sharp cracks against the lingering echo of the blast. But the attackers were well protected, using the rocks for cover. A new threat emerged from the dust behind them. 2 more riders, who had been waiting at the canyon's entrance, were now charging forward, blocking their only escape. They were meant to be the anvil to the hammer above. The world devolved into a nightmare of noise, dust, and confusion. Eliza's horse reared, screaming. She fought to control it, her knuckles white on the reins. Beside her, Owen cried out, a thin whimper of terror. One of the riders from behind was galloping straight for them, a long knife in his hand, its hilt a flash of red. He was focused on the calves, but the boy was directly in his path. In that instant, everything slowed down for Eliza. The shouting, the gunfire, the panicked bellowing of the calves all seemed to recede into a distant roar. All she saw was the man with the red knife, his face twisted in a predatory grin, and the small, terrified form of Owen beside her. "Owen, get behind the rock!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the din. She shoved the boy from his pony toward a shallow alcove in the canyon wall. As he scrambled for cover, she swung the heavy shotgun up, the stock settling into the hollow of her shoulder as if it were made for her. She didn't aim so much as point, her entire being focused on the single, oncoming threat. She pulled the trigger. The shotgun's blast was a deafening, concussive roar that was all her own. It kicked back hard against her shoulder, a brutal, numbing impact. The man on the horse was simply erased from his saddle, thrown backward by the sheer force of the blast as if swatted by an invisible giant. His horse, riderless, shrieked and veered away. The second rider, seeing his partner fall, reined in hard, his face a mask of shock. Silas, seeing the opening, fired his rifle. The man slumped forward, then toppled sideways from his horse. The sudden, brutal finality of it all seemed to stun the men on the ridge. In that moment of hesitation, Jonah acted. He spurred his horse not away, but forward, charging directly toward the rockfall, toward the fight. He yelled a name, a raw, guttural cry. "Morrow!" One of the men on the ridge stood up, emboldened by the chaos. It was the leader, the man who had faced Jonah after the stampede. Rake Morrow. He raised his rifle to take aim at Jonah. A fatal mistake. Jonah's rifle fired once. Morrow cried out, not in pain but in surprise, dropping his weapon as he clutched a bloody hand. He scrambled for his horse and spurred it away from the rim, back into the hills. His men, their leader gone, fired a few more panicked shots and then vanished after him. Jonah didn't hesitate. He urged his horse up a steep, treacherous scree slope, finding a path that seemed impossible, and went after Morrow. The chase was a desperate, pounding rhythm of hooves against rock. They galloped through a landscape of twisted, skeletal junipers and jagged stone, a place that lived up to its name, Devil's Paintbrush Ridge. Jonah pushed his horse. His focus narrowed to the single fleeing figure ahead of him. There was no thought, only instinct, a cold, pure pursuit. He finally ran Morrow to ground at the very edge of the ridge, a place where the world fell away into a sheer 1,000-foot drop. Morrow reined in his horse, which danced nervously at the precipice. He was trapped. He turned, cradling his wounded hand, a sneer on his face that was part fear, part arrogance. Jonah dismounted, his rifle held loosely at his side. He walked slowly toward the other man. "You're a harder man to kill than they said. Creed!" Morrow spat, his eyes glittering with malice. "Who's they?" Jonah asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Morrow laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think this is about a few scrawny calves?" He fumbled inside his coat with his good hand and pulled it open. Pinned to the lining of his vest was a small, shiny brass pin, the insignia of the Mid-Prairie Rail Company. "This is about progress, the future, mister. Nick sends his regards. He wants you to know that the company always gets what it wants." The entire map was laid bare. The threats, the dynamite, the fear it was all just business, written in a ledger in Calder Nix's fine, educated hand. For a long, terrible moment, Jonah thought of Samuel, dying of thirst under an indifferent sky. He thought of the sacred promise he had made. He could end it right here. One shot, one less piece of filth in the world. It would be so easy. It would feel like justice. But then he thought of Eliza, her steady hands cleaning the hate from a bandit's knife. He thought of her standing in front of Owen, a shield made of courage. They were trying to build something here, not just tear things down. Revenge was a fire that consumed everything, leaving only ash. Law, imperfect as it was a foundation. Jonah did not raise his rifle. He holstered his revolver, walked forward, and pulled a length of rope from his saddle. Morrow watched him, a look of disbelief on his face. "What are you doing? Kill me and get it over with." "No," Jonah said, his voice flat. He grabbed Morrow's wounded hand, ignoring his cry of pain, and lashed it securely to the saddle horn. He tied the other hand to match. "You're going to stand trial. You're going to tell everyone in Red Mesa about your brass pin." He chose the law, a heavier and more difficult burden than vengeance. He swung onto his horse, took the reins of Morrow's mount, and began the long, slow ride back to town, leaving the devil's paintbrush behind him. Later, after the dust had settled and the dead had been attended to, Silas and Eliza worked to clear a narrow path through the rockfall. The surviving calves, now calm, drank from canteens. As they worked, prying smaller rocks loose, a sound became audible. It was a soft, trickling music. At the very bottom of the canyon, emerging from beneath the rubble, a thin, determined stream of water was still flowing. The dynamite had scarred the land, but it had not been able to silence the small, stubborn pulse of Cottonmouth Creek. It still ran, a silver thread of life in a broken land. Jonah's return with Rake Morrow, bound and delivered to the town jail, should have been a victory. Instead, it was the lighting of a fuse. The news of the railroad's brass pin on a bandit's chest spread through the valley. But it did not unite the people. It fractured them. Calder Nix was prepared. He did not deny the connection. He redefined it. Within a day, official-looking notices were posted in Red Mesa Crossing. The Mid-Prairie Rail Company, acting under a federal charter and in the interest of national progress, was officially invoking its right to eminent domain. They would acquire the necessary land for the public good. The price would be set by the company, and resistance was, the notice implied, both futile and unpatriotic. Cedar Hollow Ranch was to be acquired by compulsory purchase. The news broke the valley's fragile spirit for those who had sided with the railroad. It was a confirmation of inevitable progress, a sign that their future was finally arriving. For those who stood with Jonah, it was a declaration of war, a sign that the law was just another weapon to be used by the powerful. Friendships strained and broke. Arguments that had been confined to the town hall now spilled into the general store, into the blacksmith's shop, into the dusty street itself. The valley was a tinderbox, and Calder Nix had just struck the match. The rage, when it came, was not aimed at the faceless company, but at the man who stood in its way. To the desperate, Jonah was no longer a symbol of independence. He was the rock that was damming the river of prosperity. By late afternoon, a crowd began to gather at the Coyote Lantern Saloon. It was a grim assembly of men whose faces were tight with a fear that had curdled into anger. They were farmers whose fields were barren, ranchers whose herds were skeletal, men who had been promised a salvation that was being blocked by the stubbornness of one man. Their talk, fueled by cheap whiskey and Calder Nix's smooth reassurances, grew louder and uglier. As dusk began to settle, they lit torches. The flickering orange light cast monstrous, dancing shadows on the walls, turning worried faces into hateful masks. They started to move. A slow, shuffling procession of grievance, their boots stirring the dust, their torches leaving a trail of acrid smoke in the still air. They were marching on Cedar Hollow, a clumsy, self-righteous army determined to force Jonah to sign the papers, to save them from their own ruin by sacrificing his. At the ranch, they had seen them coming. From the porch, the procession was a slow-moving serpent of fire crawling across the darkening plains. A deep, primal fear settled over the ranch hands and their families, who had gathered at Cedar Hollow for safety. This was not a fight against hired guns in a remote canyon. This was their neighbors, their face lit by the flames of their own resentment, coming to tear their world down. As the mob drew closer, the sky seemed to answer the turmoil below. The relentless, empty blue of the past months had vanished. In its place, the clouds had been gathering all afternoon, building in the west, layer upon bruised purple layer. They were not the soft, hopeful clouds of a gentle shower, but the hard, angry anvil heads of a thunderstorm. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange, metallic scent, and the silence between the gusts of wind was deep and expectant. Just as the leaders of the mob reached the ranch's front gate, a single, jagged fork of lightning ripped the sky in two, from the heavens to the horizon. It was a silent, incandescent tear in the fabric of the world. The thunder that followed was not a rumble, but a deafening crack, as if a great bone had snapped. The dry world held its breath. Inside the ranch house, panic was a rising tide, but Eliza was a point of stillness in the storm. She ushered the women and children, and the few ranch hands not standing guard with Jonah, out of the house and into the large, windowless storeroom. It was a place of safety, its thick adobe walls a shield against the world. The air inside was cool and smelled of burlap, dried beans, and dust. The faces around her were pale in the lantern light, their eyes wide with terror. The shouting of the mob outside was a muffled, angry roar. Eliza looked at their trembling hands, at the fear that was threatening to overwhelm them. She walked to a small crate and picked up a handful of chalk nubs, the same kind she used in the schoolhouse. She moved through the small, huddled group, pressing a piece of chalk into each person's hand, even the smallest children. They looked at her, confused. What good was chalk against men with torches? "They are shouting about what they want," Eliza said, her voice clear and calm, a bell in the storm of fear. "We need to remember what we are here for." She turned to the rough wooden wall. In large, steady letters, she wrote, "We are here for water and for each other." She handed a piece of chalk to Silas's wife, whose hands were shaking. "Write your name," Eliza urged gently. "Claim your place here." Hesitantly, the woman stepped forward and wrote "Mary" on the wall. Then Silas, who had come inside, took a piece and wrote his own name beside his wife's. One by one, they came forward, a silent procession of defiance, the men, the women, the children, each scratching their name onto the wall. The small, scraping sounds of the chalk were a quiet prayer against the angry shouts outside. They were not just hiding, they were bearing witness. They were a community, drawing a line not in the sand, but on the wall of their shelter. The confrontation at the gate was reaching its breaking point. The mob surged forward, their torches held high. Jonah stood before them, a rifle held loosely in his hands, his face grim. "Go home," he said, his voice a low command. "This is not the way." "Sign the papers! Creed!" a man yelled, his face contorted. "Don't you doom the rest of us with your pride." Just then, a new party arrived, parting the mob like a ship through an angry sea. It was Calder Nix, his suit immaculate as ever, accompanied by the county sheriff and 2 deputies. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting nervously between Jonah and the torch-wielding crowd.
"Jonah Creed,"
Nix said, his voice as smooth and slick as oil.
"This has gone far enough. The people have spoken. The law is here. For the good of the community,
you will sign the transfer agreement." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Jonah, my hands are tied. The company has the paperwork. It's for the public benefit." His voice trailed off, his words tasting like ash in his own mouth.
Public benefit."
Eliza's voice cut through the tense standoff. She had emerged from the storeroom, walking calmly through the armed men until she stood beside Jonah. She was holding the railroad's funding proposal in her hand. "Is this what the railroad's public benefit looks like?" Sheriff, a promise sealed with a lie. She handed the document to the lawman.
"Look at the seal. It's a fraud. A piece of brittle wax stuck on with oil. A child's forgery."
The sheriff took the paper, his brow furrowed. He ran his thumb over the seal as Eliza had done. It crumbled, just as she'd said. He peeled the rest of it off, revealing the unmarked paper beneath. A flicker of doubt, then anger, crossed his face. He was a simple man, but he knew the look of a true legal seal, and this was not it. He looked up at Calder Nix, a hard question in his eyes. "What is the meaning of this?" "Nix." Nix's smile was a thin, tight line. "A clerical error, nothing more." He never finished the sentence. A single, sharp gunshot cracked through the air from the darkness beyond the torchlight. The shot was not aimed at a person. The bullet slammed into a large drum of lamp oil standing near the barn. The metal drum ruptured, and in the next instant, one of the mob's torches was tossed through the air. It landed in the spreading pool of oil. The world erupted in a pillar of fire, a great roaring whoosh as the oil ignited, sending a column of greasy black smoke and incandescent flame 50 feet into the air. The side of the barn was instantly engulfed. The heat was a physical blow, driving everyone back. The dry, seasoned wood of the barn caught immediately, the fire spreading with a hungry, terrifying speed. The mob's angry shouts turned into screams of panic. This was Rake Morrow's doing. Escaped from the flimsy town jail, he had returned not for a fight, but for a final, nihilistic act of chaos, his last service to the man who had hired him. The fire was an apocalypse. It was a vision of hell, the culmination of all the heat, the drought, the anger. It was going to consume everything. And then the sky broke. It was not a sprinkle, not a shower. It was a deluge. The first drop was as large as a coin, hitting the dusty ground with a loud plop, and then 1,000,000 more followed. A solid, roaring wall of falling water. The heavens opened, and the rain came down not as a blessing, but as a judgment, a force of nature unleashed. It hammered on the roof of the house, on the parched ground, on the terrified people. It hit the fire with a great hissing roar. Steam and smoke billowed, but the sheer volume of the water was overwhelming. It was a battle between 2 elements, fire and water, rage and salvation, and the water was winning. The rain doused the torches, which sputtered and died with pathetic hisses. It soaked the angry men to the skin, their rage washed away by a cold, shocking dose of reality. It turned the dust to mud, running in dark rivers across the yard, washing the ash and the anger away. It was the sound of the world being reborn. In the midst of the downpour, in the surreal landscape of steaming, blackened timber and running mud. Jonah turned to Eliza. His face was streaked with soot, his hands black with ash from trying to beat back the initial flames. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, and his eyes, in the dying glow of the fire, were filled with a raw, overwhelming emotion. He reached for her. He didn't speak. He simply pulled her to him, his ash-covered hands coming to rest on her back, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had just been torn apart and remade. He held her with a desperate, trembling strength, and the soot from his hands stained the back of her clean dress. Eliza did not pull back. She did not flinch from his touch or the grime of the fire. She leaned into him, her arms going around his neck, holding on just as tightly. She buried her face in the hollow of his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, of smoke and rain, and the clean, wet earth. The storm raged around them, and the fire hissed its last dying breaths. But in the circle of their arms, there was a profound and unshakable quiet. On the porch, a single lantern that had been lit against the dusk sputtered once, its flame finally drowned by a gust of wind-driven rain. It went out with a soft foot, plunging the yard into a deeper darkness. All that was left was the roar of the rain, the cool, clean smell of the thirsty ground drinking its fill, and the quiet, steady rhythm of two people breathing, their breaths mingling in the clean, washed air. The Red Mesa Town Hall, which had so recently been a crucible of hot, dry anger, was now cool and damp. The great rain had washed the world clean, and the air that drifted through the propped-open doors smelled of wet earth and sage, a scent of absolution. But inside, the atmosphere was as tense and charged as the moments before the lightning strike. This was not a meeting of a mob. It was an emergency hearing, convened by the circuit judge, a man named Harlan, who had arrived on the morning stage, his face as stern and unyielding as the law he represented. The room was packed, but it was a different crowd from the one that had carried torches. The faces were the same, but the anger had been replaced by a somber, uncertain quiet. They were here not as a mob, but as witnesses, their loyalties fractured, their certainties washed away by the fire and the flood. At the front of the room, at a long trestle table, sat Judge Harlan. To his right sat Calder Nix, looking as immaculate and unruffled as ever. Next to a sharp-faced lawyer from the East, a man named Davies, whose leather portfolio was filled with the railroad's power. On the left sat Jonah and Eliza. Jonah was a study in stillness, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the judge. Eliza sat beside him, a small ledger book held in her lap, her posture straight, her expression calm and resolved. The proceedings began with the cold, precise language of the law. Mr. Davies rose and laid out the Mid-Prairie Rail Company's case. He spoke of federal charters, of national imperatives, of the undeniable march of progress. He presented signed affidavits from merchants and landholders who welcomed the railroad. He unrolled a large, professionally drafted map showing the proposed route, a clean, bold line that cut through the valley. "This is not a matter of personal grievance, Your Honor," Davies concluded, his voice smooth and reasonable. "It is a matter of public good. The law is clear. When the needs of the nation, the needs of the community for commerce and connection, outweigh the interests of a single landowner, the public good must prevail. We have made a generous offer. Mr. Creed's refusal is an impediment to the prosperity of this entire territory." The lawyer's words were heavy, authoritative, each one a carefully placed stone in a wall of legal justification. Several men in the crowd nodded, their belief in this clean, simple version of the future reaffirmed. Judge Harlan turned his gaze, cold and impartial, to Jonah. "Mr. Creed, your response." Jonah stood. He did not look at the lawyer or at Calder Nix. He looked at the judge. He held no papers. His evidence was of a different kind. He unrolled a piece of yellowed, cracking animal hide on the table. It was a map, drawn in faded ink, far older than the one the railroad had presented. "Your Honor, this is the original survey of this land, drawn by my grandfather," Jonah said, his voice low and steady, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. "It shows the boundaries of Cedar Hollow, and it shows Cottonmouth Creek." He placed a calloused finger on a thin, wavering line. "My family didn't just find this water. We protected it, through drought and flood. It has kept this part of the valley alive when all else has turned to dust." He then reached into his coat and placed a small, flat, gray stone on the table. It was a simple piece of rock, unremarkable except for the letters crudely carved into its surface. S.C. 1873. "My brother, Samuel, died of thirst in the drought of 73 inches, Jonah said, and a profound silence fell over the room, so deep that the sound of a man clearing his throat was a loud intrusion. "I buried him myself, not far from the source of the creek. That stone is his marker. That land is his grave. The railroad's line on their map runs right through it, to them. It's an inconvenience to be cleared away. To me, it is sacred ground. Their public good does not include the memory of the dead. Mine does." He said nothing more. He sat down. His testimony had not been a legal argument. It had been a eulogy and a vow. The hammer blows of his simple words had left cracks in the lawyer's polished wall. Judge Harlan looked at the stone, then at Jonah, his expression unreadable. He turned to Eliza. "Miss Marlowe, the sheriff informs me you have testimony to offer." Eliza stood. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the clear, precise cadence of a teacher stating facts. "Your Honor, 2 nights ago, I was present at Cedar Hollow when Mr. Morrow, a man who has since admitted to leading the Painted Knives, was brought in. Before he was taken to the jail, he made a statement." "Objection," Davies snapped. "Hearsay from an escaped criminal." "Overruled," the judge said, his eyes fixed on Eliza. "Continue, Miss Marlowe." "He stated that he was in the employ of the Mid-Prairie Rail Company," Eliza said, "and he showed Mr. Creed and myself a brass pin, the company's insignia, which was fastened to the inside of his coat as proof of his employment." A gasp went through the room. Calder Nix's face remained a pleasant mask, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Lies from a desperate man," Davies said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "He would say anything to save his own skin." "Perhaps," Eliza conceded calmly. "But the company's desperation seems to extend to its paperwork as well." She placed the funding agreement Nix had given her on the table. "This is a document, Mr. Nix presented to me, offering to fund a well for the schoolhouse. It is meant to look like a binding legal contract, authenticated by the company's seal." She gestured to the broken wax. "As you can see, Your Honor, the seal is a forgery. It is a hollow promise, designed to secure my cooperation through deceit. It is not the act of a company operating in good faith." Davies was on his feet again. "An insignificant clerical matter. An overzealous clerk using the wrong wax. It proves nothing." "It proves a pattern, Mr. Davies," Judge Harlan said, his voice like ice. He picked up the document and examined the broken seal himself. The silence in the room was now thick with tension. The foundation of the railroad's case, its claim to legal and moral authority, was beginning to crumble. But Davies was a skilled fighter. "Your Honor, even if we were to entertain these fanciful accusations, the central point remains. The needs of the many. The community is suffering. A single, stubborn man is holding back the water that could save them. Miss Marlowe herself, in her compassion for her students, must see the logic in this." He turned his sharp gaze on Eliza. "Miss Marlowe, do you deny that the children of this valley are suffering from the drought? Do you deny that the railroad's presence, the wells it will dig, the prosperity it will bring, would be a salvation for them?" He had backed her into a corner. To agree would be to support his case, To disagree would be to deny the suffering she fought against every day. Eliza did not answer his question directly. Instead, she bent down and lifted the small, worn ledger book from her lap. She opened it on the table.
"I do not deny the suffering, Mr. Davies,"
she said, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I document it." She looked at the judge. "Your Honor, this is my school register, but it is more than that. I have made notes here." She ran her finger down a page. "Owen Pike. His family's well went dry in August. He has fainted in class from the heat twice. Sarah Miller. Her family has been hauling water 10 miles for 2 months. She has missed 12 days of school from exhaustion. Caleb Jones. His family's cistern holds less than a week's supply." She continued, her voice steady, a quiet litany of hardship. She listed each child, the state of their family's water supply, the toll the drought had taken on their small bodies. She was not making an argument. She was reading the names of the wounded from a battlefield. She was giving the community's suffering a human face. She was taking it out of the abstract realm of public good and placing it in the real world of thirsty children. The room was utterly still. It was a silence so profound it felt like the heart of the wilderness itself. A silence filled with the ghosts of thirsty children and broken promises. The men who had marched on Cedar Hollow with torches looked at the floor, the memory of their anger turning to shame. The only sound in the entire hall was the scratching of Judge Harlan's pen as it moved across his paper. It was a dry, relentless sound, the sound of facts being recorded, of a verdict being written. Finally, he set down his pen. He looked at Calder Nix, and for the first time, his gaze was not impartial. It was filled with a cold, deep contempt. "This hearing is concluded," he announced, his voice a gavel in the silence. "This is my ruling, effective immediately. The Mid-Prairie Rail Company's order of compulsory purchase of the Cedar Hollow Ranch is hereby suspended. A full and formal investigation is to be launched into the company's activities in this territory, including its potential involvement with the criminal gang known as the Painted Knives and its use of fraudulent documents." He looked at the sheriff. "You will provide Mr. Creed and his property with your full protection. Is that understood?" The sheriff, his face a mixture of relief and resolve, nodded sharply. "Yes, Your Honor." A collective sigh went through the room, a release of breath that had been held for months. The spell of the railroad was broken. People began to stir, turning to look at one another, the hard lines of division on their faces softening. A few men approached Jonah, their heads bowed. "We were wrong, Creed," one of them mumbled. "We were just scared." Jonah simply nodded, accepting the apology without triumph. Others still hung back, their uncertainty a testament to how deeply the valley had been split. As people began to file out, Calder Nix and his lawyer packed their portfolios with brisk, angry movements. As Nix passed Eliza, he leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for her. "You chose the wrong side. Schoolteacher, progress always wins." Eliza did not flinch. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. "I chose people, Mr. Nix," she replied softly. "That is always the right side." He stared at her for a moment, his perfect smile gone, his face a mask of cold fury. Then he turned and strode out of the hall, a man who had lost a battle but was already planning the war. Soon, the hall was empty except for Jonah and Eliza. They stood in the quiet aftermath, the air still humming with the ghosts of the words that had been spoken. They walked out together into the clean, late afternoon sunlight. The mud was already beginning to dry, and the sky was a clear, brilliant blue. They stood for a moment by the steps of the hall. Jonah looked out at the valley, at his valley, which had been so close to being torn from him. Then he turned and looked at Eliza. His face was etched with exhaustion, but his eyes held a deep, quiet light. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked, his voice low. The question was abrupt, unexpected. He was not asking about Nix, or the railroad, or the fight to come. He was asking about himself, about the violence he was capable of, about the hard, unyielding man he had been forced to become. He was asking if the warrior had eclipsed the man in her eyes. Eliza looked up at him. She saw the lines of grief and care etched around his eyes. She saw the strength that had never wavered. She saw the man who had bought her a barrel of water, who had listened to her story in a storm, who had trusted her in a fight. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, a smile that reached her eyes and lit them from within.
"No, Jonah,"
she said softly.
"I'm not."
Dawn did not break over Cedar Hollow. It seeped in, a slow, quiet infusion of pearl-gray light into the deep indigo of the night. The world was washed clean, reborn. The great rain had silenced the dust and settled the arguments of the earth. On the top strand of the barbed wire fence that marked the horse corral, the leftover raindrops clung like a string of perfectly placed glass beads, each one holding a tiny, inverted image of the rising sun. The air was cool and smelled of wet soil, bruised sage, and a profound, elemental peace. It was the smell of a promise kept. Inside the ranch house, the quiet was just as deep. Jonah stood in the main room, the heart of the house, which served as kitchen, dining room, and office, for as long as he could remember. The first thing he did each morning, before coffee, before checking the stock, was to glance up at the high rafters. His Whitworth rifle rested there on 2 wooden pegs, a long, dark shadow, a silent guardian. It was as much a part of the house as the stone fireplace. It was his first and last thought of every day, the tool of protection, the symbol of his vigilance, the cold, hard reality of their world. It was always ready. But this morning was different. He reached up, his hands easily finding the familiar weight and balance of the rifle. He did not check its load or wipe it down. He brought it down from the rafters, the movement slow and deliberate in the still morning air. He walked to the heavy oak table that stood in the center of the room, and he laid the rifle down upon it. The sound of the heavy steel and polished wood meeting the solid oak was not loud, but it filled the silence of the house. A soft, definitive thud, a full stop, an abdication. He had never done this before. The rifle lived on the rafters, ready for use, or in his hands. It did not lie on the table where they ate, where they planned, where they lived. To place it there was to disarm himself, not just of a weapon, but of an entire way of being. It was an act of faith, a statement that, for this morning at least, the greatest threat was not outside the walls, but within his own guarded heart. He stood looking down at it, at the long, deadly grace of its form, and felt the immense, terrifying lightness of setting down a burden he had carried for a lifetime. Eliza entered the kitchen then, moving as quietly as the morning light. She had come from her small cabin, drawn by the scent of the coming day and the unspoken pull of the main house. She had not bothered with her sleeves. They were rolled to the elbow, and her arms were bare. The golden, slanted light from the single window caught her as she paused in the doorway. It illuminated the faint, silvery line on the inside of her left wrist. In the soft, forgiving light of this new morning, the scar seemed less a mark of violence and more a delicate, intricate part of her, like the fine blue veins that traced a map beneath her skin. It was no longer screaming its story. It was whispering it. Her eyes went first to Jonah, standing so still by the table, and then to the rifle lying upon it. She understood the significance of its placement immediately. It was a flag of truce in a war he had been fighting alone. He turned to face her. The silence between them was no longer the empty, waiting silence of the drought, but a full, rich silence, thick with unspoken history and the trembling possibility of a future. It was the silence of two people who had seen the worst of each other's worlds and had not turned away. Eliza took a step into the room, then another. She stopped a few feet from him, her gaze clear and direct. She had a choice to make. She could let the moment pass, retreat into the safety of their established roles as rancher and schoolteacher, or she could walk through the door he had just opened. "No one's touched me," she said. The words were the same ones she had spoken in a whisper at the water auction, a confession of a long and painful isolation. But this time, they were different. Her voice was not a whisper. It was quiet, but it was steady. It was not a confession seeking pity. It was a statement of fact. It was an offering of the whole, unvarnished truth of herself. It was a trust she was placing in his hands, a fragile thing that had been broken once and had taken years to mend. It was not a plea. It was an invitation. Jonah's heart beat a hard, thick rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat in the quiet room. He had lived his life by the creed of action over words, but he knew this moment required a language more delicate than either. He took a single step toward her, closing half the distance between them. He raised his right hand. He did not reach for her. He did not presume. He simply held it out in the space between them, palm open, fingers slightly curled. It was a question, an offering, a silent echo of his words from the night of the storm. It was the hand of a man who had roped cattle and fought men, calloused and scarred. But it was open. It was waiting. It did not tremble. Eliza looked at his hand, at the story of his life written in its lines. Then she looked into his eyes, and she saw the story of his heart. She saw the memory of his brother, the weight of his promise, the fierce and gentle strength he had guarded for so long. She took a breath, and with it, she let go of the last ghost of a cold Missouri blizzard. Slowly, with a will that was entirely her own, she lifted her hand and placed it in his. The act was conscious, deliberate, like a person dying of thirst taking the first life-giving sip of water from a cupped hand. It was a choice. The moment her skin met his, a current seemed to pass between them, a slow, spreading warmth that started in their joined hands and moved through them both. His fingers closed around hers, a gentle, encompassing pressure. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a gesture of such profound tenderness that it made her breath catch in her throat. The warmth spread, a quiet tide rising against the shores of their long solitude. It was a heat that had nothing to do with the sun, a fire that did not consume but instead nourished. It flowed over the old, faded scar on her wrist and across the vast, lonely desert that had existed between them. And in its place, something new began to grow. From the yard outside, a new sound broke the spell. The high, clear voices of children. "Miss Marlowe, Miss Marlowe, are you awake?" It was Owen Pike, his voice full of the boundless, uncomplicated energy of the morning. A moment later, from the calving pen, came the soft, contented lowing of the calves, a sound of simple, animal affirmation. The world was returning. Their life was waiting. The fight was not over. Calder Nix and the Mid-Prairie Rail Company were a storm gathering on a distant horizon, a threat that was wounded but not defeated. The future was not a safe harbor. It was just another frontier to be faced. But the difference, the monumental, world-altering difference, was that they would now face it together. This morning, this quiet moment in this sun-drenched kitchen was theirs, a foundation laid on the bedrock of truth and trust. Jonah looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. He saw the flicker of a question in her eyes. He knew what he had to say. A small bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, born not of fear or heat, but of the overwhelming intensity of an emotion too long held in check. He spoke, his voice a low, rough whisper, meant only for her. "When I said, worth holding on to," he paused, his throat tight, "I meant you. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to give it an extra boost, hit the hype button to help more people discover it.